Salamone, the podcast, presents A Lover's Guide to the Never-Ending Apocalypse, Part 1, Prologue and Understanding Fundamentalism and Their Call to Bring About the End of the World. Welcome to Salamone. I'm Michael Salamone. This was to be the last episode of the podcast before taking like a winter break for the holidays and the such. But due to recent events, I think we're going to power through it a few more weeks because there's plenty to unpack and talk about. This will be the first installment of a multi-part series looking at the state and future of humanity. Like many Americans, I was heartbroken when I learned of the acts of terror unfolding in Paris this past weekend. And also, like many Americans, I was unaware that other acts of terror, led by those same nihilists distorting religion for their own political power agenda, happened in Beirut and Baghdad that same day. The media didn't tell me about those. Twitter wasn't trending with that information. I'd not known the true scale of how humanity was terrorized globally that day. I've since educated myself about French politics. Facts are facts, and we don't debate facts on this program. Climate change is real. Income inequality is worse than it was in 1774, and a majority of Muslims are peaceful, loving people. The number one killer of Muslims is ISIS, the people who attacked Paris and these other cities. The religion with the most people on this planet is Islam. We can discern that abortion clinic bombers aren't representative of all of Christianity. Certainly we can discern ISIS from the greater Islam. Anyone who cannot, in my opinion, is just bloodthirsty, looking for an excuse to go to war with brown people. The evil lies, just as it does in Christianity, as it does in Judaism, as it does in Islam, in fundamental extremists who twist their agendas into rationale for evil acts against their fellow human beings, that their twisted views belittle as less than human. As news of the terror in Paris broke almost so quickly you'd wonder if they knew it was going to happen, conservatives and neocon liberalists took to social media to declare war on Islam, to make racist commentary about Muslims, to tweet narratives about how we need more governance, spying, and tighter borders. Anti-Islamic commentary came from celebrity and childhood friend alike on social media. Social media was a cesspool of hatred. And a door was opened for the politicians who feed on that sort of fear to help usher in a new era of never-ending war for the military, media, industrial complex to get fat from. Sure, we saw love and light too. The same people who speak up for justice and empathy about every other barbaric thing we've seen in recent history were there to remind us that we mustn't form lynch mobs to go after our Muslim brothers and sisters. We collectively changed our profile pictures and posted little notes of solidarity. Beneath half the population beating drums, the rest of us had a different fear, that the never-ending war was about to get more never-endinger. After all, a good number of us live day to day wondering if this will be the day that humanity devours itself anyway. All we need is our bloodthirsty brethren to push us further down the rabbit hole of nihilism in pursuit of the apocalypse. Bloodlust should not be answered with bloodlust. An eye for an eye until the world is left blind, and we see the path these war hawks are clamoring for us to take. There is no excuse, reason, or rationale for the violence these fundamentalist terrorists have inflicted and will continue to inflict on humanity. They must be stopped. There is no question. However, we need to take the smartest path, and we need to recognize all of the facts. All Muslims are not extremists. Giving up privacy and safety of the citizenry by taking away human rights and the ability to encrypt your data leads us down to a road of fascism. And though these nihilistic thugs are absolutely disgusting, murderous monsters, there is Western complicity in creating this culture of violence. Without recognizing those facts, we will never find a real and lasting solution. You can't carpet bomb an ideology. And it will take the citizenry to discuss these issues, because a handful of media companies devoted to the military-industrial complex are never going to encourage this dialogue. Sure, there are still real journalists out there, but they're not on your television and not usually in your Facebook feed. You have to seek them out. You have to educate yourself. You have to educate your loved ones. And you have to discuss what's really happening in the world. Fact. Terrorists take power because of poverty and fear. Fact. Multinational corporations profit from creating and then fighting terrorism. So let's look at Paris. It was just 10 years ago this month that the city was last under state of emergency. Massive income inequality and xenophobic racism towards French immigrants, mostly Muslim, led to riots and much worse. According to the emails recovered from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's secret server, the French government and French companies conspired to steal the oil reserves in Libya in coalition with her desires to overthrow Gaddafi. In Syria, where refugees are fleeing for their lives because of climate change and a drought and an oppressive government with these ISIS terrorists as rebels fighting as well, the State Department funded these disgusting pigs of ISIS trying to oust Assad. Secretary of State Clinton was complicit in funding these same Islamic extremist groups that became ISIS in her desire to overthrow both the leadership in Syria and Libya. Compounded with the regime changes and never-ending wars that we've already inflicted upon ourselves with Iraq and Afghanistan, the West took small rebel groups and made them our biggest enemy. And now that enemy, a psychopathic cult, hell-bent on murdering us and making us go to war against all of Islam, has real power and is committing real terror. The never-ending war drums to fight the problems the West helped incubate. Make no mistake, I agree with Bernie Sanders. We must demand our Muslim allies to form coalition with us to wipe out these fundamentalist monsters. We shouldn't be engaged in regime change, but instead, we should be assisting our allies in fighting terror. Furthermore, I feel we need to put the boot down on Christian fundamentalists who burn churches, bomb abortion clinics, and murder our gay, bi, and transgender brothers and sisters right here in America. We must wage war against fundamentalist terrorists at home and abroad. However, I do not believe this war is won by taking away the rights from the citizenry through racial profiling or through blanket bombing a region of the world. This march to the never-ending apocalypse is only curbed by humanity finding commonplace that we will not tolerate intolerance, that hatred and violence are not rights of the citizenry, that we put an end to violence, put an end to income inequality, put an end to poverty, put an end to hunger, and the other problems at the roots of the weed of terrorism. We must dismantle the military-industrial complex's corporate profits from perpetual war and violence, and lead a charge for humanity to embrace a new era of caring for each other and protecting each other from fundamentalism and tyranny. And this is without speaking about the topics of oil, the poverty of the region, the lack of dignity of the average citizens in the Middle East. Dignity. I believe we should always treat even our enemies with dignity. For this reason, I have not decided if I will use the term Daesh instead of ISIS yet. World leaders, including Secretary of State John Kerry, are urging us all to switch to the term Daesh, simply because the terrorists don't like it. I need to learn a little more before I start referring to ISIS as Daesh, so I probably won't throughout this broadcast. This all boils down to a simple philosophy that we discuss often on this show. We must lead with love, not fear. And so this is the first part of a series I plan on doing maybe to the end of the year. I'm going to call it A Lover's Guide to the Never-Ending Apocalypse. My goal is to explore the complexities and truths behind the war drums, to fight ideology, and hope that by understanding the conflict, the roots of the system of injustice, the evil corruption of faith into fundamentalism, we might somehow all survive. Joining me is Reverend Quincy Worthington, a respected theologian, a regular on our program, and a voice against fundamentalism in not only Islam, but within his own Christian faith. Q, I'm going to throw some philosophical stuff at you tonight as well as political stuff, mostly because I consider you to be the show's voice of reason when I tend to get a little bombastic. But first, Quincy, in your sermon this weekend, you tackled these issues. Dear listeners, I encourage you to just search Quincy Worthington on YouTube. You'll find his church and be able to watch his sermons. But Quincy, how would you relate your speech Sunday morning to the rant I just went on?
Yeah, I mean, what I talked about mostly this Sunday morning was, one, I think that it's important to try to understand and combat the causes of what creates terrorism and people wanting to become terrorists. And two, that even in the face of terrorism and abject horror and tragedy, like this become just too commonplace in our world today, that we can't ever lose hope or give up on our own ideals and our own, essentially our own faith journeys. Because I think essentially when you give up on hope, when you give up on the idea that the world can and should be better, that's, to me, that's when they win and we lose.
I invited you to study the last 10 years of history of French xenophobia and racial strife, as well as the deep economic inequality and poverty there alongside me this weekend, as well as the French government and business exploits throughout the Middle East. But after looking at the same articles and research that I did, do you feel as I do that there's at least some context with the French government's relationship to the Muslim community in these other countries in the Middle East? A little context to these tragic events?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of information, and I'll be honest, I read it this afternoon, and I'm still kind of trying to digest it. One of the things that we saw come out of the Democratic debates Saturday night, last night, I guess, that I really agreed with was that it's a complicated situation, and there's a lot of things that go into these things. I don't think that necessarily justifies or excuses the attacks, but I think it does. It gives it a different context and a different light than the one that generally is portrayed by mainstream media. The temptation is always to think that these things come out of nowhere, but the laws of physics tell us that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And so that's another thing I talked about this Sunday or this morning that I worry about, is that have we begun or are we continuing to perpetuate a cycle where extreme terrorism just gets more and more extreme with every new terrorist that we create? So the idea was we get rid of Al-Qaeda, and then that would, suddenly freedom would blossom in the Middle East. I don't know what the idea was, but we just thought these were horrible people, let's get rid of them. And then ISIS came into existence, where Al-Qaeda was saying, whoa, these people are too extreme for us even. So what happens if we get rid of ISIS? That just breeds more room for more terrorism, and probably even worse terrorism. Now, is that a reason not to combat ISIS? No, I don't think it is, but I think that we got to look at and understand the root causes and the history behind these things, and they are terribly complex. I guess I don't expect foreign relations not to be terribly complex, but we need to seek understanding in where people are coming from, even if we are horrified by where they're coming from.
I thought that was one of the better parts of the debate myself, was Bernie Sanders kind of took up that argument that regime change has just made this more complex, has just encouraged the more extreme of these terrorists to come to power, I mean, that's what we see with Daesh or ISIS, is they have become so well equipped from fleeting armies like the Iraq army and taking their equipment and then taking oil wells and getting wealth that way. And it's kind of because we keep meddling in the region. So possibly he's onto something with it. We have to talk to the moderate, I hate that term, moderate Muslims, because we have to talk to the majority of Muslims and to those countries in the region that are of that mind to find a solution that they can enforce and have their back. I don't know if that's the right path. I talked with a friend that is a very sound military mind. He, to me, said that you have to make a commitment that this is the war we're in and go for it. I trust that he believes that. I don't trust that's the right answer. Quincy, do you think there's a military solution here?
Oh, gosh. I feel so vastly unqualified to answer that question. It's not even funny. You know, I don't know. Here's my hesitation, right? Is like, you know, from being a student of the nonviolent movement, the whole premise behind the nonviolent movement is that you appeal to the humanity of your oppressor, right? So, like, the March on Selma was a horrifyingly resounding success because once the national media picked up on people being beaten and sprayed with fire hose and having dogs unleashed on them, it appealed to the humanity of the people watching and more specifically of the white community. I don't know how you appeal to the humanity of people who execute 200 people in mass graves by beheading them. You know, but at the same time, I want to say that I'm still a firm believer that no one is beyond redemption, right? That every person is redeemable. Yeah, heck, that's the message of Star Wars even, right? I mean, if Darth Vader's redeemable, then anybody is redeemable. If Darth Vader can come back from the dark side, then anyone can. And not to not to trivialize that. I mean, that essentially is at the heart of the Christian message too, right? And so,
and other religions. Yeah,
exactly. So I don't know what that says about military action. I mean, I feel, I guess it depends on what you feel the role of the military is. If they're to preserve and protect our way of life, then I guess they run a defensive position. And essentially you can take an isolationist stance that way, saying we need to worry about securing the borders and making sure what happens in France doesn't happen here, or helping our allies defend them. Or, you know, you could say, you know, we can help empower the Middle Eastern militaries to take care of it. And to be honest with you, I mean, if you study like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you know, he says that the oppressors that essentially the release from oppression has to come from those who are being oppressed and not outside forces in order for it to really stay, right? And I guess you could argue that we've tried to do that with arming the rebels, but that's turned into a mess too. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think that the answer is that the people who are in the regions that ISIS are trying to control, they have to be the ones who rise up against and help fight ISIS, and we have to then help support them. But again, you know, Bernie Sanders makes a very good point that that's a regime change, and that really complicates the living bejesus out of things. So there's my long rant of me trying to think through this and coming to absolutely not a single helpful conclusion to you. So,
no, but it is good dialogue, and that's what we do here is we try and flesh these issues out a bit, so hopefully you, me, and anyone who tunes into this might think about it just a little bit differently. And for me, that's how I come to awareness. I have to go outside of my box and think of things a little differently. But I thought it was funny you brought up Star Wars, because I thought long and hard on that very topic today about the new Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens, how the classic Star Wars films, the original trilogy, ends with Return of the Jedi. They've defeated the dark side. They've defeated the Empire. And now this movie will pick up some 30 years later. And it's a rebel faction of those who have believed in the dark side and the Empire. I was reading that Luke Skywalker will be a myth, that they indoctrinate those in the Empire to believing that he was an enemy to the great good who was Vader, whereas the general populace, who is now formerly the rebels, but now the Free Society, he's just a legendary, like Christ-like figure. I feel that those themes are relevant to the discussion, and don't trivialize it, but I'm a sci-fi nerd, and I apologize to anyone listening who disagrees with that. But it leads us to the part of, while you were talking and thinking, I agreed with what you said, that maybe there's no diplomatic solution because this isn't a rational enemy. Again, like I said, you can't carpet bomb a philosophy. You can't reason. You can't sit down for talks with those folks either. But is there a peaceful solution? That's really what I keep coming back to, that question. Is there a peaceful solution? And I'm not sure I can find one. Can you?
No. I mean, if I knew the answer to this, I wouldn't be on the phone with you. I'd be on the phone with the Pentagon right now. So,
well, you're on the phone with me because I begged you, because you are a brilliant mind. I believe the only real solution is probably born from my own idealism, and I know it's not practical. I've never been a practical man, but I believe the only solution is to make the world into a place where there's a basic priority to make people feel safe and valued as human beings, a basic access to education, healthcare, food, clean water, shelter, all the things that should be the infrastructure of humanity, so we're not embattled in fear and hatred and violence. So these ideologies don't take root with people who have no hope. I don't know. Does that make me too much of an idealist?
One of the things I said this morning was, to hold on to ideas like that might sound awfully naive, but a man saying that him being tortured and crucified was going to somehow change the world sounds pretty naive too, and yet that's what we as Christians affirm and believe, right? Not because of the crucifixion, but because of the resurrection. And I'm not willing to let go of the idea that, no, I don't think it, I don't know. If people want to call me misguided and naive for thinking that there has to be a peaceful solution and that love ultimately defeats hatred, then, I'll take that shot. That's fine. That's fine. But then you also have to take the shot that a short, skinny, bald Indian guy overthrew the British Empire by fasting and nonviolent sit-ins, right? I mean, that says something right there.
Indeed, and a majority of Muslims, in my understanding of the Quran, is that type of principle as well, where peace and love should be the guiding values to how we treat each other, care for each other, and set up the infrastructure of society. I've been reading since the Democratic debate about another thing Bernie Sanders brought up. It's funny, the media is going off about how Hillary Clinton's Lois Griffin strategy of 911, I'm a woman, really did well for her, but I thought though he started kind of weak, Bernie Sanders was so strong on foreign policy. And one of the facts that he brought up that I'd heard, I'd read, I hadn't researched until today, was about how climate change, and I had read a bit about how climate change is going to be the biggest threat to global security, but not that it was really a route for terrorism. And I studied that today about how the drought in Syria, which is, scientists say, was climate change related, has maybe not the cause of the unrest there, but it's just been such a powerful force in amplifying it. The CIA, many experts agree that climate change is helping the spread of terrorism, and that's just one example that I read. There's basic necessities like the access to clean water fought for around the globe, where warlords take hold of villages over something as basic as clean water. And it makes me wonder, since we're not taking action to fix our planet, how is it ever going to be possible for us to stop fighting each other for survival?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm really glad that you brought that up because I thought that was an interesting argument that he had made, and I was curious where he was kind of coming from that with, and I'm glad you brought that up. So I don't know. I'm still kind of trying to think through this stuff myself.
Well, let me rephrase it as, does income inequality turn people towards violence? I mean, I think we see that in poor American communities. Is it fair to say that the basic instinct for survival, when people have nothing, makes them consider the least humane of options?
Yes, I would agree with that.
So to kind of continue down that road, as I stated at the top of the show, and I say as often as anyone will let me, that economists say that income inequality is worse today than it was in 1774. That's 2 years before the Revolution. That's a time period where there were multitudes of slaves in this country driving the economy. Do you think the United States will suffer these sorts of acts of violence from the hands of our own citizenry? And we are already seeing them, but they tend to be more racially or pro-life inclined. But if we don't fix income inequality here, aren't we leaving the door open for more domestic terrorism? Absolutely.
I mean, I think that was the concern about what was going on in Ferguson, right? Was that a lot of people felt like this is probably the beginning of that happening, right? And I mean, these are things that Bernie Sanders has been warning us about for quite some time. I mean, you can only push people so far before they start to push back.
Yeah, and I really feel we are at a cuspis of history where we either have to fix it, or the power structure which profits from things like institutionalized racism, warfare, cheap labor, all these issues that we'll talk about tonight and in future episodes, and we've talked about in past episodes, that if we don't get on board, this is our opportunity to make real change. We've got a movement behind Sanders. The people are, to borrow a phrase from Black Twitter, they're woke. Stay woke. We have this opportunity for that political revolution to make real changes in income inequality, to get campaign finance reform, which is probably at the root of a lot of the American problems, and affect our foreign policy, where maybe we do lead with compassion somehow more than drones. I don't know. One of my favorite novels growing up was Tom Robbins, Skinny Legs and All. In it, fundamentalist Christians are trying to force the end of times to fit the narrative of their religion. I feel like reading that book has prepared me for modern life. So Quincy, we talked about this a little offline. Do you believe as I do? And as we discussed last week when discussing Christopher Hitchens' work, he wrote about how he believes there are religious fundamentalists, both Christian, Jewish, and Islamic, trying to force end times into play. Do you think that there is a degree of this religious extremism that is the ultimate goal?
I think that's the goal of most fundamentalists, right? I mean, that's definitely the goal of Christian fundamentalists. You see that in them paying to send Jews back to Israel because they believe they need all the Jews in Israel in order for the end of times to be ushered in. So that's really messed up, but happens. Yeah, I mean, See, the problem, at least in Christian fundamentalism, which I know obviously a lot better than I know Islamic fundamentalism, is that they believe that the message of the Bible is pointing us towards abandoning this world for a better next world, when really that's a gross misunderstanding of what Scripture's telling us. Scripture's telling us that we don't need to worry about the next world, that Jesus has that taken care for us. And what we need to worry about is making this world God's kingdom here on earth, right? So, like, what's interesting and what a lot of people miss is, especially with the, I guess it's called premillennialism or dispensationalism, the idea that, there's going to be, the rapture is going to come and all these, the whole left behind notion, is that, in the book of Revelation, there is no rapture. We don't go anywhere. The way the book of Revelation ends is that the earth has been purged, and purified, through a lot of different symbolism that, you're not going to have time to, we could be here for hours talking about that. But it ends with the holy city descending from heaven onto earth and God saying, "See, I make my home here among mortals." Right? That the idea is that we have to build God's kingdom here. That's what Jesus is constantly pushing us towards. Anytime anybody asks Jesus about faith or about heaven or relationships with God, Jesus always asks them, how are you treating other people? How are you living in this world? Are you doing things that are creating a heaven on earth, or are you creating things that make a hell on earth? And interestingly enough then, C.S. Lewis writes this book called The Great Divorce, which I didn't read for years because I thought it was about divorce, and it's not. He talks about that essentially in the afterlife for him, heaven and hell are the same place, but it's how you lived your life leads you into how you interpret that place, whether you interpret it as heaven or hell. And I think that's a really strong understanding of, I think, that's how I like to think of it, at least. I don't know if that's how it's going to be. Nobody knows. And to be honest, I question that all the time. But
I think there's some relationship to a thing I see passed around every year this time of year for Thanksgiving, that it's not the happy people that profess their gratitude and being thankful. It's those who profess that they're full of gratitude and are thankful that experience happiness.
Yes.
So there's a bit of that philosophy to how we are on this plane, how we accept the terms and conditions of our day to day.
But see, that's the thing. That's where the enticement of fundamentalism, and I would venture to guess that fundamentalism across the board. I mean, when you look at what they promise these suicide bombers if they complete their missions and things like that, I mean, the idea is that you abandon the pain and misery in this life for some weird interpretation of what the next life is going to be like, and say that this language that is meant to be allegory and metaphor is literal, and that's the attraction to people, is that this world is full of misery and pain and hardship, but the next world is not supposed to be, And so we abandon this world for a better next world. And that's the idea we got to combat. I can understand when your family is killed in a bombing and the country who committed the bombing calls them collateral damage, how dehumanizing that can feel. Or when you're under an oppressive regime where you don't see that you have any options, or you don't have access to things. I just got back from Guatemala, where you don't have access to things like healthy food, clean water, adequate medical care. All these things are dehumanizing. And when you're dehumanized to a certain point, you fight back, right? Or you lash out, or you start acting inhuman. Because everything around you is telling you that you're less than, right? That you're a step above animals. And so you begin to act animalistic. And I think that's really where the combat of things like ISIS lies. If it weren't so bad in their situation, would you still have terrorism to the extreme and the level you do there? And I don't think you would. I don't think you would. If the Syrians weren't under a regimes like Assad's, would things still be the way they are there? And I think the answer is no. I don't think you would have ISIS. I don't think you'd have these problems if we hadn't come in and upset the apple cart in places like Baghdad and Iraq, right? We've gone and made such a mess out of so much of this world under the guise of trying to give people the same freedoms we have, when most of the time we were trying to exploit them to preserve and protect our own wealth and our own privilege. Mm-hmm. And that's the greatest shame and scandal and the harshest criticism I think I've ever made of this country. But I don't know. I don't think that makes me unpatriotic. I think for me to try and call my country to a higher standard on something like that is a form of patriotism. But ultimately, my allegiance is to my God, and the way I've chosen to follow that God is through Jesus Christ, and so I trust Him more than I trust other people, and I'll follow where I think Jesus is trying to call me, and if that's in calling out my nation on inhuman acts, then that's where we've got to go.
That truth to power speaking is so important, and a value. There's a Thomas Jefferson quote that would back this up, but I don't have it with me, and I think it was a value that our founding fathers all held so deeply, that a true patriot does criticize. A true patriot is always looking to how we can be the best manifestation of how we govern ourselves. So I applaud that you're willing to make that statement, and I concur with it 100%. We love our country. We love our way of life, but we have values that we believe are American values of compassion. And that isn't just within our borders. That's how we treat each other worldwide. I want to go a little deeper into the apocalypse. You're a Christian minister, and you talked about Revelations. We both studied an article today about how ISIS has a very similar view of end times, and that is actually their goal by pushing for a war with the West and pushing the West to believing it's a war against all of Islam. I know you've studied other faiths. I don't know what's immediately at your mental grasp, but do you have a comparison to what we just talked about with Revelations to what these extremists, these fundamentalist Muslims believe? I don't. My main study of Islam came from studying Sufism, which is a form of Islamic mysticism.
So obviously their understandings of the end of times is going to be very different than a fundamentalist approach. And to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the Quran to speak on it at all. I anything I'd say would really be out of ignorance and unfair.
I concur. I have read the Quran more than once, actually, but I haven't studied the culture and the true practicing of Islamic faith enough to speak with any authority. But I guess I would try and wrap that with a bow of wondering, based on what we studied today of ISIS's view of end times and what we've discussed just now of Christianity's view of end times, or at least the fundamentalist versions of both of these religions, are these, I hate to use it, but I've got to say, these cultists trying to pull the same triggers?
Say that again?
The Christian fundamentalists, as well as, I would go as far as including Judaistic Zionists, as well as the Islamic terrorist fundamentalists, are their goals for end times so similar that they're amplifying each other's efforts? They're pulling at the same triggers from their worldview to make this destiny come true?
Yeah, but don't tell them that.
Don't let them know they're in concert?
Right, yeah, I think they would, they'd be pissed off if they found out that they had something in common with each other. But yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right.
So from what you said about it being a misinterpretation of heaven and hell, and that God's kingdom would actually come to earth, I want to issue the challenge to Quincy, to other Christians, to reach out to these fundamentalist sects and get them on board with fighting climate change. Maybe that's the religious buy-in we need to finally get some good climate change legislation passed.
This is going to sound funny and like I'm being trite, but I mean this 100%. I think that Westboro Baptist Church and ISIS have more in common than a moderate Muslim and a moderate Christian. And that's not a slam against, like me and a Muslim, but the belief systems are terribly, terribly similar. It's really uncanny, actually. I think that's true with a lot of things. I think really when you get down to it, the fundamentalists of each religion have would have less disagreements than the moderates or liberals of each religion if you get down to the real basis of what they believe and what they think.
I agree with you. I've seen online polls of who said it. Was it Mike Huckabee, or was it insert Arab extremists that we probably have already drone assassinated? And they're impossible to solve because they're just so similar. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's where I put in that constant disclaimer on this program that I believe faith to be a very private thing. I don't want this area of discussion to be alienating to any listeners or to be seen as an advocacy for any philosophy, anything at all. I do, however, think it's important to wonder about religious extremists and their belief systems. And because of that, I deeply value having an esteemed theologian like Reverend Worthington with us on a regular basis to dig into these issues.
Well, I disagree. I want this conversation to be as alienating as humanly possible. So,
I know Quincy well enough to let you know that was his version of humor. Reverend Worthington, one of the things after the Paris attacks started trending on social media, hit the news, that I told someone I love was, every moment is precious. We have to cherish the good moments. And after listening to your sermon from Sunday and such a heady conversation that we've had here this evening, I'm wondering if you have some similar words of wisdom to impart on our listeners with.
Well, I think that's it, Michael. I mean, my faith teaches me, and even I think on my worst days, I believe that light beats darkness, that life beats death, that hope beats despair, and that love beats hatred. And if you live your life just by those principles alone, if people really took that to heart, I think the world would be a dramatically different and dramatically better place.
I can't say enough good things about trying to be compassionate, understanding, and loving. Next episode, I'll dig into the media's role in perpetuating the military-industrial complex and continue on this lover's guide to the never-ending apocalypse theme. Until then, my thanks to the Reverend Worthington and to everyone who's tuned in. I'm Michael Salamone, reminding you to please be good to one another. Cheers. Salamone is a podcast taped live for a streaming internet audience. Find episodes and archives on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all of the places you get podcasts these days, and of course at michaelsalamone.com. I really think you should subscribe.